We always think of estrogen really only have actions on like the ovaries, the uterus, and the breasts. Here's the reality. Every single cell in your body except for 2 cells have estrogen receptors. That means there's a key on that cell that estrogen acts on it, right? So it's a red blood cell and it's a single type of brain cell in your brain, but most of the brain also has estrogen receptors.
Dr. Murray is a researcher. In fact, her PhD is in integrative and functional nutrition. She is a featured contributor for Brains magazine. She has been featured in Grazia magazine. She is the founder and CEO of Living Well Dallas Functional Medicine Center. She has a podcast titled Menopause Mastery. She also started Minerva, a national women's telemedicine company.
So we have this kind of uphill battle when we lose estrogen. If you replace estrogen, guess what? The mechanism works better, right? GLUT4 transporter works better. Uric acid levels probably normalize. There hasn't been a lot of research at that. The other thing that I think is really insidious is...
Hi, my name is Chris Burris. I'm a longevity expert and the chief scientist at a lab focused on a longevity molecule. My primary focus is to help people live longer and better lives with science. Make sure to subscribe and share so you and your friends can live longer and better. Well, actually, so you and your friends can live beyond the norms.
Hi, and welcome to the next episode of the Live Beyond the Norms Health and Longevity podcast. I met our next guest at the wrap-up party for the recent Mindshare event. Dr. Murray and I connected right away. Maybe it is that we are both Texans. She is in Dallas. I am in Houston. We probably did the typical Dallas-Houston rivalry that I just do for fun because I think they're great, both great cities. Maybe it was that we both love science and human biology, really human biochemistry. Maybe it was just because we had a couple glasses of wine. At least I know I had a couple of glasses of wine at that point. In any case, from our conversation, I knew I had to have her on the show. From my deep dive, I understand that Dr. Murray is a researcher. In fact, her PhD is in integrative and functional nutrition. She is a featured contributor for Brains magazine. She has been featured in Grazia magazine. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. She is the founder and CEO of Living Well Dallas Functional Medicine Center. She has a podcast titled Menopause Mastery. She also started Minerva, a national women's telemedicine company. I am excited to hop into this episode because I think we're going to be able to really geek out on some super sciencey stuff. Don't worry, I'm here to corral the conversation so that we can all enjoy the discussion. Dr. Murray, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. And yes, we did have a lot of fun.
That Mindshare is a great event, and that was, I think, frankly, like the perfect wrap up for the event. We debated. We actually had some team members that went home, and that was probably the right decision for the business. But my wife and I stayed, and that was also the right decision for us having fun and for the business. So it was pretty awesome. So as I was kind of preparing for this interview, I saw interviews where you really showed your researcher chops. It is obvious that you like to dive deep into subjects and swim in a space others usually don't go. Your first career was in IT at the Container Store. But from our conversation at the Mindshare event and listening to some of your interviews, my sense is that you are not destined for the fantastic IT career you would have had, but that you're actually doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. In fact, that you are living the phrase I found in your LinkedIn profile: when women step into their purpose, power, and creativity, they can change the world. So I got to ask, I like these background questions to get things kicked off. What parts of your upbringing, how did you grow up that put the right pieces in place for you to be a passionate and successful nutritionist, biochemist, and functional medicine practitioner?
Oh, wow. That's such a loaded question. But such a good question. So I actually had a really interesting upbringing. So I think first and foremost, and I don't always talk about it, but I was actually raised Christian Scientist. So for anybody that doesn't know what that means, Christian Scientists are Christians, but a lot of the belief is around that God can heal you, and so the power of prayer. So we don't participate in in medicine, period. I hadn't seen a doctor probably since my first checkup after infancy until I was 18 years old. Now, what makes that very interesting is my dad had his first heart attack at 42 years old when I was 6 years old, while we were camping in New Jersey. And Chris, you and I are contemporaries. Do you remember those tents that you drag behind your vehicle and they pop out on the out? Yeah. So
Yep.
Yes, we had one of those fancy
By the way, that was fancier camping than I did.
Yeah,
Ours was like
that was our fancy.
set up the tent on the rocks. I don't even think we had bedding. It was yeah.
This was
And
our
I always
fancy
remember Camp Yahoo because we remember all night long people from the other side of the lake were screaming Yahoo, which I don't know if that's how it got its name, but yeah, I definitely remember the camping and you had a slightly more luxurious kind.
Exactly. Well, we were camping out in the middle of nowhere in New Jersey, and my dad starts to have a heart attack. And so my mom, of course, freaks out just like any mother would, shoves everybody into our Volkswagen camper van. And we rush off to the emergency room. So at this point, I'm about 6 years old. And I'd never participated in medicine. If I got sick, you just prayed. And if you got better, cool. If you didn't, then you needed to pray more. But I was also a very scientific kid. I was the kid that took stuff apart and put it back together. I always wanted to spend time with my engineer dad. And so I walk into this hospital, and I'm watching all these people, and they're working on my dad, and they're doing all these things. So I immediately start with what every parent hates. Why are they doing that? What are they doing? And I got kind of a don't pay attention sort of, this is not for you. Because my mom kind of won the religion wars, Usually in one family, somebody's a little more dominant. My mom sort of won that out. My dad's like, I'd rather be in the garage on Sunday. And so I had this really strange upbringing where my dad was in and out of the hospital every year or two with some sort of cardiovascular event. Now, he lived till 80 years old. He is a modern medical marvel, honestly. But it was also one of those things that I didn't necessarily look at somebody in a white coat and go, whatever you say, I do, right? I'm highly critical and highly scientific. So I went through school thinking I wanted to go into medicine, honestly. And then I got into college, and I had to work my way through college. So I worked full-time and went to school full-time. And I got into college, and I was, biology major, which I aced, and it was easy. And I started looking at it, and I was dueling with three things. Number one, I also liked business. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. This is in the land of Working Girls, the movie. And, young people today don't understand that. But for our generation, we were the ones that were going to break the glass ceiling, like truly try and shove through it. So I had that desire. I really wanted medicine. But I was also looking at it just from a frank financial and can I do it standpoint. Like, I've got 12 years of school and I have to pay for it. I was like, and I got to figure out how to do both at the same time, which you can't do that in medical school. And so I took the easy way out and I got a business degree. Because I was like, I'll figure it out. I'll go back to it. Maybe I don't need that. So I get into business. I sales and marketing for about 7-8 years, and I'm working in the retail world, and I move across the country, multiple places, and become an area director. And I figure out that I don't really enjoy that at all, and it wasn't really fulfilling me. Though this is the early 90s when tech was in boom, right? So early dial-up days, but this is when technology radically skyrockets. And so at that time, I had moved back to Texas from Chicago, and I just happened to be, again, analytical. So I'm working with a team. And they keep coming in because they're into our offices and they're changing things because they're putting in this new technology. So I, of course, start asking questions and asking, well, how does that apply to the business? How do you think that's going to support the business? What is it going to do? And so I came home one day and I was like, gosh, I think I should maybe try this for a living because, again, I'm technical. So I go back to school. I earn a bunch of certifications, go back and get a bachelor's in kind of e-business technology background. And then I basically get promoted in the company to report to the CTO. And because I could understand the business and the tech, I could do that, right? So that's where I ended up for 11 years. I was the first female hired into that organization in the IT department, answering to a CTO in a very misogynistic world. I mean, I'm just going to be really honest. The things I was like, oh, the Me Too movement would have had so much fun here, right? and that was the only way you could survive. I mean, I was the first one to hire another female. And I worked there for 11 years, but I averaged 80 hours a week. I was on call 365 days a year. We just didn't have that many people, so when something broke, the call always went up the food chain. And I had digestive problems as a young person that would come and go, and you ignore them, especially I did. And then they got a lot worse, and I was diagnosed with colitis. So, when I finally was diagnosed with that, I'm exhausted, I can't function. I'm talking to the doctor, and I ask him what I think is a super simple question. Can I change my diet to affect this? Because, they immediately were going to give me these drugs, and I'm like, whoa, hold on a minute. And he laughed in my face and told me it had nothing to do with what I was eating. So at that point, I was like, I had some choice words. You can already tell I'm a little spicy. I had some choice words for him, and I started taking nutrition classes just so I could kind of examine my own experience and see, could I make changes? And it was when I did that, I was like, this is it. This is absolutely where I was probably supposed to be. It probably wasn't even medicine directly as an MD or a DO. I really need to do this because I always wanted to be more preventative. And so I ended up going back to school, getting a master's, getting other certifications, hanging up my shingle, and then creating Living Well Dallas, which is on its 19th year. And I just never thought I would get here. But here's the more just humorous part now. I went back and obviously got another master's and a PhD. So I've spent more time and more money than if I'd gone to school as an MD.
That thing you were trying to avoid.
Yeah. But here's for all the people that think about going back to school, and especially because I did that at 48, right? So I went back for my PhD at 48. Number one, you have so much more discernment when you're older, right? You have so much more worldview that you can bring into that, and the education is so much more valuable than I would have been at 20. At 20, you're too stupid and naive to really capture what's really available there. And I would speak for myself, but I would just say from a developmental standpoint, we don't have that capacity to really apply ourselves. And so it's the older student going back who actually excels.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things to unwrap, right? If you think about one, I have to ask, when you were considering pursuing medicine, how did that sit with your mom, right? Being a Christian Scientist, I think that's no. Like, how did you wrestle with that? And then I want to hear that. And then also you fast forward, and where you ended up was on the preventative side, which actually is the closest natural fit to Christian Science. I think that's really, really cool.
Yeah. So of course my dad was rooting for me for a couple different things. Number one, he was an engineer and then got kind of sucked into middle management, and he never really enjoyed it once he got there. He should have stayed in sort of a more technical role. So I watched my dad work a job that he didn't enjoy. And then my mom, really didn't have a lot of, respect isn't the right word, but she just felt that was sort of looking back on the religion I was raised in, and sort of a slap in the face in the very beginning. And I had, my own experience with that religious upbringing, that sort of changed me now. But I do agree with you that blend of having lived in an environment where you didn't poison your body with stuff. Like, that's part of the Christian Science thing. You treat your body like the temple it's really supposed to be. So, all of that is part of the tenets of, your integrative, functional, and preventative side. So I think it's a good blending of both.
Really cool. I love that backstory. Thank you for sharing. All right, let's jump into some of the meat. So I've had a number of conversations with menopause experts. You probably know them or know of them. And with you, I want to dive a little bit deeper. There is still a real fear around hormone replacement therapy and cancer, specifically breast cancer. Even my director of research, who's a former practicing gynecologist, is still convinced of the causative association. You dive a little bit deeper. Can you share your understanding of the potential impact estrogen might have on cancer formation?
Certainly. So I'm going to give some context and some history because I think that's really important. So first off, if anybody that's listening to this or watching this and they want to understand more, there's a book that I think is required reading for every woman on the planet, and it's called Estrogen Matters by Dr. Avram Blooming and Carol Tavares. Dr. Blooming is a 50-year breast cancer oncologist. Carol Tavares is a researcher PhD, and they actually have researched women's health around hormones over the last 2 decades, right? So they are absolutely the foremost experts on what is all of the historical data on hormones and cancer. So first off, hormone replacement therapy has actually been around since the 50s, and it was standard of care until really 2002. And so most of, my mother was put on hormone replacement therapy when she went into menopause with no concerns or qualms. And the Women's Health Initiative in 2002, that was originally designed to look at heart attack and stroke risk in older women, and what they were wanting to do was take older women and figure out if hormone replacement therapy prevented heart attack and stroke. So there was a couple things about this study that was very poorly designed. As a researcher, I looked at it and I was like, how did that get past committee? But anyway, so because they were looking for cardiovascular risk, which takes decades to create, number one, the average age of the women in the study were 63 years, right? So that's a good 10 to 13 years past the average age of menopause. They also excluded healthy women. So that means women who were non-symptomatic, women who were in good health, meaning they weren't smokers, they weren't obese or overweight, hypertensive, high cholesterol, pre-existing cardiovascular disease, were absolutely excluded from the population because what they needed were deaths in the time period because they didn't have 40 years to run this study, right? So, which is flawed. Right, which is flawed because you can't compare it to the original population. I mean, the number of women that were actual smokers, still smokers, was astronomical, which is in itself a cardiovascular risk factor. And so that study, over a period of time, first they were using oral estrogen as conjugated equine estrogen, which is from horse pee. Sorry, just is.
Yep.
And they were using synthetic progestins, which carry clotting risk on their own. Period. And so they had a group that were taking those, and then they had a group that were taking the equine estrogen only, and then they had a group that had none, right? And they looked at the comparison. In the group that had the synthetic progestins and the estrogen, they showed an increased risk of cardiovascular events. So they ended the study while they were reviewing it. And again, oral estrogen has its own clotting risk. Synthetic progestins have its own clotting risk. Then you add obesity and smoking and existing cardiovascular disease. That's a recipe regardless of hormone replacement. And so they stopped the study. And when they were writing up the study, there was a sub-part of the committee that, I can't get the quote exactly correctly, but there's a subgroup of the committee that were responsible for writing up the results and the data, epidemiologist and biostatistician, that they wanted to show that they needed to end the crazy rampant use of hormone replacement despite the fact that it had been done for 50 years. And so they went into the study with a bias, right? That bias that it needed to be stopped. So as they're writing up the data before peer review, they expose the data to the media. So peer review is really, really important because that makes sure that the data is correct, that the interpretation is correct, and that they're not taking creative license to manipulate the statistical analysis to confirm a bias, which is exactly what happened. They basically manipulated the data to look a certain way. So they submit it to, basically the media runs with it. Well, one of the statistics that the media ran with was in the data itself, the risk for breast cancer in women goes from 1 in 1,000 once you're over 50. So all women, 1 in 1,000 of us have a risk. 4 in 1,000. Sorry, my brain's a little off today. 4 in 1,000. So every woman over the age of 50 has a 4 in 1,000 risk for breast cancer. In the data in this study, the women that were on the synthetic progestin and estrogen had a 5 in 1,000 risk, right? So again, not clinically meaningful. If you have 1,000 women line up, 4 have to step forward, the 5th one's not going to make a difference, right? Now, so what they did is they wrote up that statistic that it was a 25% increased risk. Right? So that's a statistical lie, right? I can make things look really sensational with statistics. Yes, 4 to 5 was a increased risk, but it was not clinically relevant at all. What's really interesting is they also buried in their own data, the women that were taking estrogen only had a 23% reduced risk of breast cancer. So I want that to sit. 23% reduced risk of cancer, particularly breast cancer, right?
Now, is that 23% the same 25% they were saying was the increase in cardiovascular incidence, right, where it went from 4 to 5? And
no, so the 4 to 5 was just 4 to 5. Every woman, if you're not doing hormone replacement, as soon as you turn 50 and you lose your hormones because you've gone through menopause, your risk for breast cancer accelerates. Right, and then so the risk for heart attack and stroke was a bigger risk. It was a little more statistically significant, and it's because oral estrogen and synthetic progestins cause clotting risk as we get older, particularly. So the important thing that was lost in the data, and intentionally so, was that the women that did the estrogen only brand, like the only arm, actually had a significant reduced risk of breast cancer, even compared to the women who did nothing. Right? So all of that. So let's talk about what the study said before that. Pretty much every study, and it had been extensively studied prior to the Women's Health Initiative, showed that estrogen did not cause cancer. That even outcomes in women being treated for breast cancer were better when they were on estrogen. And even more importantly, one of the most common drugs that's used to treat estrogen receptor positive cancer is a synthetic estrogen, tamoxifen. Right? So, we've been sold a false bill of goods. And it's because women were terrorized from that media rush, and unfortunately physicians and the medical establishment never bothered to read the supplemental and entire data coming from the Women's Health Initiative. They took the sensationalism and ran with it. So the majority of women are dealing with physicians and clinicians that honestly haven't read the research at all. And actually they've released 18-year, 20-year, and 22-year follow-up showing there was no increased risk of breast cancer. Their data themselves shows that, right? Including they went back and re-statistically analyzed all their data prior. Even the assertions they made before was a lie. But of course, nobody's picking that up. And so what we have to think about then is, if tamoxifen, which is a estrogen receptor B drug, so we have two receptors for estrogen. We have one called estrogen receptor A, that is what they call proliferative. So it makes cells grow, right? We have estrogen receptor B, which is suppressive. So it suppresses over proliferation, too many growths of cells. With cancer cells proliferate, they grow. So tamoxifen is a predominantly estrogen receptor B drug that turns on this anti-cancer activity. Right? Your natural estradiol that your ovaries produce when you're fertile hits both receptors, but also hits estrogen receptor B pretty heavily, right? So if we look at that and we go, okay, synthetic estrogen is protective, tamoxifen, because it hits that estrogen receptor B. When I don't have my ovarian hormones, because the eggs have run out, so I like to think of it as an egg carton, and when we hit menopause, the egg carton is empty. It's gone. Right? So we don't have that. So our ovaries no longer produce it. The reality is we no longer have that productive estradiol that's hitting both receptors A and B, but probably stimulating estrogen receptor B more strongly. However, we do have environmental chemicals, phthalates, pesticides, herbicides, parabens, BPA, all plasticizers, all of these things that are circulating in our body that are estrogenic or xenoestrogens. Where do you think they're hitting? Those receptors. Yeah, probably receptor A. Yeah. Right? So the idea that our estrogen that we have made since puberty, that is protective. So for women that have a baby before 20, they have like a massive decreased risk in breast cancer over their lifetime. The more children you have a greater reduction in risk. Women who go through menopause early and or never have children also have an increased risk of breast cancer. So your estrogen is protective, right? All of those stats add up mathematically. And so estrogen is protective against cancer. It is not cancer proliferative, especially if it's hitting estrogen receptor B. So as women, we have other things that hit that receptor when we don't have our own hormone. We also have another hormone, which is called estrone. And estrone is made by our fat cells. And so we make a little bit of estrone, but when we go through menopause, that ramps up because the body is looking for estrogen. So one of the things that happens to women is on average, we gain 10 to 15% of our body weight doing the exact same thing that worked before when we go into menopause. So a 150-pound woman can expect 15 to 20 pounds of weight gain for no reason at all except for the loss of estrogen. Now our body makes that fat, so we'll make more estrone. And estrone is carcinogenic in comparison to estradiol, and its byproducts can be carcinogenic. And so I believe, this is my hypothesis, I don't have tons of research, this is where I would love if somebody would give me money. I believe that if we were to look at the genetics, the metabolites of estrone, and start looking at populations of women with cancer, we would see a lot of estrone in a form called estrone sulfate and its byproducts that are hitting that estrogen receptor, particularly A, and that is why we see an increased risk for breast cancer postmenopausally. It's not estradiol, but once you have it, estrogen might be stimulatory. However, you're more likely to get cancer if you don't have estrogen.
Okay, that is a lot to unwrap.
Sorry, Chris.
I like it. I like it a lot. I actually want to start back with your mother, who you said they put her on hormones. Because I know a lot of, you met my wife at the event. My wife is an influencer talking about menopause in Spanish. And I think one of the reasons that she's built a big audience, and you can probably confirm this, is I get this sense that a lot of women are ill prepared for menopause. They don't know, even actually, I guess it was Menopause Day on Friday. I think it was National Menopause Day on Friday, and I was actually using ChatGPT to send a couple, things to my wife, like, hey, women celebrating the challenges of menopause, which is the irony there, right? And my director of research, again, a former practicing gynecologist, he's looked at that and goes like, those women are too old for menopause. Like, they're well past menopause. And I think that's the picture that we typically have. It's like you're in menopause when you're all gray and, maybe even in the direction of frailty. But that's not the reality. How was and maybe you've never had a conversation with your mom, but it seems in my picture, just as you described, she started entering menopause. They gave her hormone replacement therapy, and it was maybe handled better than it is now. Do you have any sense of that? Because maybe I got it all wrong.
Yeah, standard of care up until 2002 was women got hormone replacement therapy. So I can't remember the exact stats, but it's somewhere between 30, depending on the country, 30 to 50 to 60% of women, that was standard care. You went into menopause, everybody went on it. Now the latest statistics, 1.83% of women get hormone replacement therapy. So here's what the windows show. Right. So the average age of menopause in the United States is 51. Right. So some women, I have a woman that's 58 that's still cycling, and she's like, when will it be over?
I just want it to end.
Yeah, I just want it to end. I went through somewhere around 47 to 48. Right. So I went through kind of early. So there's a couple things that happen. So Dr. Mosconi's group out of the Weill Center at Cornell, for the first time, captured this on studies on imaging. And they had to create actually a tracer for the estrogen receptor in the brain to actually see this. So essentially, they took women and they scanned their brain multiple times over normal fertility years, perimenopausal, menopausal. And for the first time ever, we captured in the brain what the brain was up to as you go through menopause. And the dogma was that women, when they go through menopause, lose their receptors for estrogen. And that was just an assumption. There was no science, there was no research. That was just somebody spouted it and people ran with it. We had no way to prove that. Well, Mosconi's group proved for the first time it's the exact opposite. The body actually massively reproduces and produces more and more estrogen receptors because estrogen is so important to the brain, right? So we saw it on imaging. Now, there's a couple things that show up. So, for instance, hormone replacement therapy, particularly estrogen, has been heavily studied. Actually is protective against dementia, right? That's what almost all women are also frightened of. Literally a 34% reduced risk of dementia if you do hormone replacement. Now, what the studies also show is the earlier you start it in that transition, the better off we probably are. And it's not because those receptors die off, because again, that was the assumed dogma, is that you don't have any receptors left. That's not true. The problem is estrogen, and I would argue progesterone and testosterone, which are the two other sex hormones, are protective to the body. For instance, estrogen helps remodel the vascular system, so your arteries get protected and remodeled appropriately when you have estrogen. When you don't, you get atherosclerosis and arterial plaquing. So you get, cholesterol buildup underneath the surface, and you get a narrowing of your arteries. You have increased loss of bone, period. All women are losing bone if they're menopausal, if they don't replace. It's just to what degree and how quickly you show frailty, and what did you have to begin with. And then you've also got, the brain has receptors, and we see the brain remodeling during menopause. We also see brain volume decreasing during menopause when you don't have hormone replacement, right? That's also a risk pattern. And so the reality is when we look at the act of aging accelerates as soon as we don't have hormones. So that means our risk for disease and death accelerates when we lose our hormones. If we replace them earlier, we slow down that process, if not stave off a lot of that process. If we start, let's say I'm 65 and I'm starting, I may have already increased my atherosclerosis and bone loss, and you have, right? And so we haven't done a lot of studies other than the Women's Health Initiative that utilized those women. The unfortunate part is they weren't using healthy women, so you can't generalize the results they had to women who take care of themselves. Now, with that being said, there was a study that came out this year, and it was a study of women in Medicare. So that means their average age was over 65. Mm-hmm. And they retrospectively went back and looked at mortality data from 2006 through 2022, and they looked at 10 million women. This was a gigantic study. And they looked at women who were on hormone replacement and stayed on it. They were like, I don't care what the Women's Health Initiative said. I'm not going to feel bad. I'm going to stay on it. They looked at a group that did it for a short period of time, because that was kind of the let's make people happy in between thing, just to get rid of your hot flashes. And then they looked at the women who did nothing. And they looked at all causes of dying, heart attack, stroke, deep vein thrombosis, osteoporosis falls that end in death, breast cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, endometrial cancer. In all instances, hormone replacement reduced the risk of mortality. And some of them were huge. Lung cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, anywhere from 3 to like 21%. Endometrial cancer, well over 20%. Heart attack, stroke. And then this was the first time they had an arm in the hormone replacement wing that included topical preparations, right? Because in the last 30 years, we have better science. And we know that if we put estrogen on the surface of the skin and testosterone on the surface of the skin, it doesn't pass through the liver. We don't have to worry about it creating byproducts that are clot creating. And then oral progesterone also is bioidentical. And so in the arm that was on the topical preparation of estrogen, so estradiol or Abiast, showed, and progesterone, showed no increased risk for cardiovascular event or clotting or stroke. So whatever cardiovascular risk was there that keeps everybody from giving it to older women was completely mitigated by a topical preparation. Now, do we see fanfare about that study? No, and it makes me so mad.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's why I think you and a lot of our friends go on to podcasts and share this information. All right, so 34% reduction in dementia. That's the scariest disease on the planet, right? And that's for people for women who are on estrogen. Any indication of whether topical is somehow better than oral or whatever is certainly the last example you gave was for older women and not having a negative impact on cardiovascular incidences. But what about in general?
In general, in that Medicare study, the 10 million women, both showed about the same outcome, right? So either or, but I would say the general rule is, as a scientist, I mean, the beauty of you and I, Chris, is we can look at the data, but we're not biased because I don't prescribe. I'm not an MD or a DO, so I can just look at it and go, here's what the data said. And I would say today's data definitely supports topical preparations of estrogen and topical preparations of testosterone, and I would say oral preparations of micronized progesterone.
Hey, super quick break from the podcast. Hopefully you're loving it. This is a way you can support the podcast and take advantage of a great offer. We're offering 50% off of one of our MCT bottles. MCT is an amazing oil. Add the ESS 60 molecule to it. It's even more amazing. All you got to do is leave a review on iTunes, send us a notification that you've left that review. We'll get you a coupon code that'll get you 50% off of our MCT oil and free shipping. Back to the podcast.
One of the things is, so this just really stands out to me because it's always fascinating from a longevity perspective. If you've had a child, if you've had more than one child, you're reducing your risks of cancer, right? Was that cancer and maybe cardiovascular? Any ideas there? Because anytime you can do like something once and have it have, obviously having a child is a big decision, and it's not like, hey, let me just have a child because I want to have positive health later. But anytime you can try and dig into that, any thoughts on like what might be driving that long-term benefit? And maybe it even has to do like you have children that you're responsible for. I mean, it could be some other factor. I don't know, but do you have any thoughts there?
Actually, they've done a few studies looking at women who have gotten pregnant and maybe, either had a stillbirth or like a late term or moderate term, loss, miscarriage. It's actually the act of being pregnant. So it's the act of those hormones. So, for instance, when a woman starts her period, her hormones are at their absolute lowest. So estrogen's incredibly low. When you ovulate, it skyrockets anywhere between about 400 and 500, right? So you get this massive surge of estrogen, which causes you to ovulate. And then it drops back down, and then it comes back up on the second half of your cycle, along with progesterone, which is where your body sort of prepares the uterus for implantation. And then both of those hormones surge. So your progesterone is going to be like around, let's say 30 to 35, your estrogen's going to be in the 300s, 200s to 300s, so you get this spike. Every month, our hormones do that. So we get a lot of these surges. When we're pregnant, our estrogen's going to skyrocket to 4,300, at least. And so if you were to average that, you're looking at, 9 months of a 4,300, right? Progesterone is also skyrocketed, right? So these hormones, there's no question that those hormones are doing something that are protective, and it is the surge in those hormones that seem to be protective. One of the other things that I thought was really interesting about Dr. Lisa Mosconi's work is they looked at women's brains during pregnancy and like pre and post. And when we're pregnant, our brain goes through, again, this massive sort of pruning and rearrangement. So the women that get, baby belly and baby brain where they can't think, right? What happens is your brain literally pulls neuro pathways away from the frontal lobe, which is memory, cognition, function, executive function, and drags them back to the amygdala, right? Which is your, oh my God, I'm not safe, act. And because women will say, I had my baby and I have these really irrational fears that start to come up, right? I'm like, no, it's actually your brain making sure that you will protect that baby at all costs.
Yeah.
But the brain,
irrational fears better than no fear when trying not to get eaten by a lion. Yes.
exactly. And so there's a pruning that happens, right? And then once you get older, the kids grow up, there's a sort of a shift back and the cognitive function sort of swings back to the brain. And then we go through menopause, we see a change again. It moves away from the amygdala and it sort of repatterns into proprioception and some of the more creative centers. So looking at that means that these hormones are incredibly important to our longevity and protection, right? So somebody like myself, I chose not to have children. I also started my period about the same time everybody does, but I also ended earlier. So all of my risk for breast cancer are higher, just for those reasons.
Yeah. No pregnancy, earlier menopause. Yeah. Let me collect my thoughts because there's a lot here. I'm wondering if there's this concept, and I don't know how accurate it is, that we all have some cancers growing in our body at any given time. And you're talking about kind of an estrogen B receptor being a suppressive receptor. So I wonder if this massive spike just includes a lot of suppression and is actually mitigating any sort of cancers that are there. And so like if you can get back to baseline, at age 21 versus the rest of the population who isn't getting back to baseline, which baseline optimally would be 0, it'd be interesting. Also, we're having later and later term pregnancies, right, with the support of IVF and everything. There's got to be somebody out there collecting data about the implications there, right? Because if that theory is correct and we're getting back to some sort of baseline because of this real huge spike in estrogen, I don't know, that's just a whole lot of fascinating stuff. And then is it is it that and the answer probably is multiple pregnancies because that's been studied, or is it the fact that maybe you're having them later that gets you a reset later in life? I think all of this is fascinating. I don't know if you have any opinions. I was just pontificating there.
Yeah, no, I do. I do. I mean, obviously, earlier, more frequent, all of that is protective. What's interesting is, women are born with their eggs. Men reproduce sperm. So we have basically an egg carton. We get whatever number of eggs we have. And we do get, the ovaries age more quickly than the rest of the woman's body. And they actually set some of our clock, right? So our age clock on our ovaries are more sensitive to environmental chemicals, aging, and everything else. And so as we age, the later we have a pregnancy, the more risk there is with that pregnancy, whether there's a risk to mom and also risk to fetal development. I haven't dove really deeply into the late-term pregnancy risk and if it's mitigating also breast cancer risk and things. My assumption is any pregnancy is probably helpful. But what's really interesting is a lot of women, like let's say they did IVF or something like that and they had a pregnancy late in their, let's say early to mid 40s, which is a late pregnancy. A geriatric pregnancy in gynecology is 29 years old.
That is not what people think.
I know. I wasn't even, I was still like, I don't know. I wasn't ready at that point to think about children, and it just kind of continued.
We had dinner with a couple, and I think they're like 28, right? Maybe she's 29, so they're right at that age, and he's actually in residency, and so part of him has to know, like, you're about to, like, you guys, they're like, hey, we're still 5 years out before you have kids, and like, I get it, but my wife and I had trouble, and I, probably should do it now. Like the sooner the better. There is an actual clock, and I know, and I know that's I don't know. People don't. I think women don't want to hear that, but it's just there is a clock, and yeah, there's things you can do, but those things get really expensive, and those things sometimes don't work, right? Like, so it's an interesting situation. So after 29 is a geriatric. Wow.
Yeah.
That's not what most people think.
No, huh? Because you got to remember our average lifespan was 40 years old.
Yeah.
Up until about 1870. Right.
Yeah.
So you and I had been long in the ground.
Yeah. No.
And,
we're supposed to be missing teeth, right? Teeth are supposed to have fallen out, and
just all kinds of messy, right? And so if you're somebody that's like in your mid 40s and you get pregnant either on your own or through, IVF and IUI or all those things, it is not uncommon after you go through breastfeeding that you never come back to baseline. A lot of women, that sort of pushes them into menopause. Right. So so I think some of the protective effects, definitely there's a protective surge effect of having those hormones, but I don't think everybody gets the same benefit if we wait, And I think of it from a natural selection standpoint. The reality is nature only cares if we procreate and reproduce. Right.
And
really
potentially help your grandkids. Right. Like I think there's a little bit of, it would be nice if you help your grandkids, but don't take their resources.
Right. Exactly. Well, yeah. And, like wildebeest give birth while running, and that baby just basically hits the ground and starts running, right?
I didn't know that. It's
yeah, they do. And so, ours take at least, 10 years to get functional, and then really 18 to hopefully leave your house. And in many cases, they boomerang and they stay there till they're 30.
Yeah.
Right. So there's definitely the grandma hypothesis. And so, I look at that and go, okay, our longevity hasn't our fertility hasn't caught up to our longevity. And so in 1900, our average lifespan as a woman was 57 years. So that means I've got 2 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So our longevity now is 80, 85. Some of us are going to live to 100 and something. So, 100,000 years from now, even without human intervention, would we go through menopause at 75? Probably. Right? There's a lot of research, going into preserving ovarian function later in life to allow for not just fertility, but obviously there's a protective effect.
Yeah, I remember, I think I saw a Netflix special where a lady had, I don't think it was just some of her eggs. I think actually some of her ovaries kind of pulled out because she was going to go through some oncology treatment, which is just brutal physically. And then they had attached some of it to her arm, and she ended up getting pregnant because she had some active so she still had her ovaries in place, but like it kick-started everything, even though it was implanted in her arm. And I'm like, there's some fascinating things that could be going on there. Is there any indication that menopause is happening any later? Is it happening any sooner? Are we still on track for how we've been for 50 years? Because that would be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there's a pretty interesting spread. You have some variation. We do see the onset of puberty earlier, and that's part of its body composition. So we have to have a certain amount of body fat in order for our ovaries to kind of kick into overdrive. So as kids get heavier, we see earlier, like girls that are 8, 9 years old starting their cycle, which is as a kid you're traumatized at 11. So like, that's just
that's 3 years earlier. No.
Yeah. So that's kind of interesting. We still have about the same number of years,
of fertility. Yeah.
Kind of average. I would say it's probably shrinking a little bit, and I don't know if we can answer why. I again think there's so many compounds and toxins in our environment that look like estrogen that they kind of mess with our natural fertility.
So this already has been exactly what I was hoping, like deep dive. You have some kind of thought processes about uric acid, and I think metabolism, and I don't know if those are exactly intertwined, but I kind of want to, like, how is metabolism impacted? And then I think uric acid fits in there somewhere, but if it doesn't, then just separate those two, please.
We always think of estrogen really only have actions on like the ovaries, the uterus, and the breasts, right? Here's the reality. Every single cell in your body except for 2 cells have estrogen receptors. That means there's a key on that cell that estrogen acts on it, right? So it's a red blood cell and it's a single type of brain cell in your brain, but most of the brain also has estrogen receptors. And so that was fascinating to me when I actually, read that in school. I was like, okay, that's interesting, because that means that the loss of estrogen or the variation in perimenopause is a full body impact. And for me, I went into menopause early. Right? There's a couple things that happened. I had my tubes tied. I didn't want to be on birth control anymore because synthetic birth control is much higher than what we naturally produce. It's got its own risk factors. I had my tubes tied. At the time, the doctor told me, oh, it's not going to impact anything. Well, yeah, it actually kind of threw me.
And you wake up the next day and you're like, he was wrong. He or she was wrong.
Yeah. So, I got acne. My hair started falling out. I started gaining weight. I had been a bodybuilder. Like, I'd been living in this bodybuilding experience for like 7, 8 years. I knew how to manipulate my body composition. And all of a sudden, I'm like, what is going on? I'm getting a front butt. And they're like, no, you're fine, right?
And you're like, no, I'm not.
Well, I own my clinic, so I have, functional medicine luminaries that I can work with. And I went through what a lot of women went through, and I was like, if I am going through this, and I'm probably one of the most invested and knowledgeable, everybody's going through this. So there's a metabolic effect to the change in these hormones. So especially what I'm going to do is dig in as what's happening when they start to decline rapidly. So estrogen, number 1, plays a role in how your body takes glucose once it's inside the cell and transports it to the powerhouse, your mitochondria. Mm-hmm. One of the main transporters is a thing called GLUT4. So I like to think of that as like chutes and ladders, right? So we have chutes. So this chute it doesn't have very much grade. So instead of it being like almost vertical, it's a very low grade. Like you might get mildly tired trying to walk up of it, but not much. So that GLUT4 transporter is accelerated by estrogen. And so when we lose that estrogen, now think that your glucose is kind of on a slow roll to get to the powerhouse. So we can become much less efficient at using our glucose every day for activity, right? Particularly in the muscles and the brain. Number 2, the work of Rick Johnson, okay, a researcher out of University of Colorado. He's now since retired. He's the world's uric acid expert. So uric acid we've known about since the late 1800s. And, early on we figured out that diseases of aging, particularly cardiovascular risk diseases and diabetes risk, always has associated higher levels of uric acid. Most people think of that with gout, right? It gets very high and then it has this sort of toothpaste-like build up in your joints, like your big toe or your knee or your ball of your foot, and it hurts. But uric acid's been well known that as uric acid climbs in the bloodstream, we get hypertension, we get accelerated aging, we get elevated glucose, we get atherosclerosis, so it's just bad, right? So Rick Johnson and his team were looking at people with high blood pressure and looking at water consumption, so this is a really good thing to know. And we know that salt will raise uric acid. Aged foods, alcohol. So, the person that's like, I eat charcuterie every day and I have, a bottle of wine at night and I'm a saltaholic, you're raising your uric acid. So what they did is they took people that had higher levels of uric acid and they were trying to figure out whether salt was really impacting high blood pressure. And so they had the people drink enough water to dilute basically their serum to dilute out the salt. And they found, hey, that made this huge difference. So people who are salt sensitive and high blood pressure, drink more water. You can get rid of that sensitivity by doing that. But one of the things that they found was it had an impact on the uric acid level. So they started looking at uric acid along with a bunch of other researchers. And what they understood was that there was an impact inside the cell itself, the mitochondria. Another set of researchers were looking at animals who hibernate, right? So bears, squirrels. So in the summertime, when they start eating more carbohydrates, so if you follow a bear, they'll knock over your entire cabin to get to anything sweet, right? And so they're doing that to put on weight, right? So they could gain weight, get fat, so they could go into hibernation, so they're not eating for several months out of the year. The activity that drives the food intake and the fat storage is controlled inside the powerhouse by uric acid. So uric acid goes up in the powerhouse slows, fat accumulation and hunger go up. Then they started looking at every single cell organism on the planet or multi-cell organism in the planet has a uric acid mechanism. And it makes a caterpillar turn into a butterfly, it makes it makes animals hibernate. In the human body, what it does is it does the same thing as a hibernating animal. When uric acid climbs inside the mitochondria, it changes the ability to make energy, ATP, so that gets diminished, so we get less energy output, increases another byproduct called ADP, which we won't go into. And so it slows the engine, so you slow down, and it increases fat storage and raises uric acid at the same time. So knowing all that, I'm like, okay, so uric acid, fat switch, gain weight, fat switch, what drives it, high fructose corn syrup, sugar, all those other things. So then I was just like, well, what happens in women? Because we have this aged turn on of a 10 to 15% body weight gain for the loss of estrogen. And it's like a clock. Well, lo and behold, the research shows that women are in menopause have an increased serum level of uric acid that coincides with the loss of estrogen. Right? So that's the mechanism for the 10 to 15%, I think, 10 to 15% weight gain that we see when women are doing the same things that worked when they were 30. Yep. Right? And so we have this kind of uphill battle when we lose estrogen. If you replace estrogen, guess what? The mechanism works better, right? GLUT4 transporter works better. Uric acid levels probably normalize. There hasn't been a lot of research at that. The other thing that I think is really insidious is we hate the jiggly bits. So it's the fat that's subcutaneous on our butts, hips, thighs, and abdomen. Women always hate that. But that's actually protective. There's two other things that happen to women. The loss of estrogen drives visceral fat, which is the fat underneath the muscle around your arteries and your organs, right? Increases inflammation. So that's what's driving cardiovascular risk. And the research shows, ladies, exercise and caloric restriction has no impact. You have a harder road to hoe. So all the women that are talking to a trainer that's like, you just need to work out more, eat more protein, and eat better, you're in an uphill battle. Number two, the nerves that go into the fat cells that sort of turn on, say, the fat liquidation and pull it out of the cells and pull it into the bloodstream, those nerves, those adrenal receptors for those nerves go to sleep with the loss of estrogen. So for a woman, we get more fat weight gain around the middle, so our midsection gets wider. Underneath the muscle, we get more fat deposition on the abdomen, butts, and thighs, and both of them are turned on because of the loss of estrogen.
And that's actually the less healthy fat, right? Like kind of external fat is you may not like how it looks, but it doesn't have the detrimental cardiovascular impact. And so a key way to kind of reverse this uric acid effect is with estrogen, right? So with hormone replacement, what is it, if somebody's not interested in that, what do they do? Do you have like a plan? I don't know, we'll call it a D because it's not as effective.
Yeah. It's funny because I have put some things out online because there's a lot on social media about just selling things, right? And this is, there's a lot more awareness today about menopause, but I would say most women are struggling understanding that. And, and there's a lot of claims being made, rebalance your hormones and restore your estrogen levels with this herb. So the first message is none of them will do that. The egg carton is empty. The ability for your ovaries to produce estrogen is gone. Along with it, testosterone and progesterone. Our adrenal glands produce a very small amount, but again, the primary estrogen that we make is estrone. So that's the reality. So I'd be a strong push for at least talk to a clinician that knows, your history and that can go through your history. Because the other thing is when we replace estrogen, when we're talking about it in a premenopausal and a postmenopausal woman, we're replacing to about 10% of what you made. So that needs to sink in. So you're not getting somebody to 4,300 or 500. You're getting them to like 60, 80, 100. That's it. So very, very low levels. Now, with that being said, if somebody's not a candidate or maybe they've got, cancer history or they're under cancer treatment, they can still do vaginal estrogen, which I would highly recommend. The genital urinary syndrome of menopause is very damaging down there. Not only do you get vaginal atrophy, painful sex, but a high risk for UTIs that are potentially deadly as you get older, and also yeast infections. But some of the herbs, so I have products that I made that help with the symptoms, right? So herbs like black cohosh, red clover, maca, all have an impact on the modulation of the thermostat that helps with basically controlling your body temperature, which is estrogen controls that. And so when it gets kind of all over the place, you get these wild surges up and down, and so your thermostat messes up. So often if you're taking an herbal compound like, Metabolism Mastery or something like that, you're going to get an improvement in sleep quality and overall hot flash. So your symptoms get better. Right? And you can also, in some cases, like my products, have some cortisol managing herbs in it as too, because we also see an increase in cortisol in women that are menopausal. So those herbs and things like that can absolutely reduce the risk, but they don't improve the overall mortality risk. And I think that's my big driver. And it's funny because I was talking with my marketing team and they're like, Betty, no one cares about their longevity and the disease risk. And they're like, they're more worried about the size of their butt, right? And I was like, I got it. It's somebody with junk in the trunk. I'm naturally curvy, right? But I do look at that. And because I have a mom that's in an assisted living and she's full assist, right? And I walk in there every day and there's one man and it's all women. So the reality, the numbers are, we will live longer than men, but our health span, so how long our health is good, is shorter. Right? So we're the ones that are filling assisted living centers and memory centers and basically losing our life slowly on a slow dwindle. Men actually have, a more fatal event as they're older. But the reality is, too, is women are more likely to have a fatal heart attack or stroke the first time than men because we lose that estrogen. So I look at all those things and I'm like, putting a little bit of estrogen and progesterone and testosterone in not only makes you age more slowly, but it may very well protect your brain, your heart, your bones, so you can live longer and die more quickly when it's the end, which is what I would want to do. I'd rather blink out than sit in a chair somewhere and not know what's going on.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because the knee-jerk reaction, even me, and I've been thinking about this for years now. Of you die more quickly. It's like that. Does that sound good? And then when you really spend the time to think about it, I think the answer is yes. I think the best analogy that through all my conversations has been, I don't remember who said this, but is like that of a candle flame, right? Because a candle burns the same height all the way to the very end, and then it just snuffs out and it's done. And I think that's what most people are looking for when it comes to, they just don't want to be a burden. I think the current statistic is about 20% of your life is in some form of decline, and that's the thing that people aren't interested in.
Yeah.
And you're right. My product is kind of rests on a longevity study, and you look at the search data, right? You get to put your marketing hat on. You look at the search data. Not that many people are looking for longevity. Like, that's not a high. Anti-aging, yes, but that's actually more about appearance than it is about actually anti-aging. And so yeah, you got to listen to your marketing team, which I know you're doing.
We do a lot in our clinic with osteoporosis. We have a DEXA device. We have a functional QEEG. So we do a lot of preventative work, against dementia and Alzheimer's. And people think that that's going to hit them, that's something I don't need to worry about until my 70s. It's not. The research actually shows Alzheimer's is a disease of your 40s and 50s. The symptoms become pronounced in your 70s and 80s, but you are actually developing Alzheimer's now.
Yeah.
Now, if you're 40 to 50.
And that seems to be so true of so many of the kind of diseases of inflammation and the diseases of aging, is like you really got to be way ahead of it, so much more ahead of it than you even realize.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you were going to wrap that thought up.
Yeah, well, so 3 out of the 4 in memory care are women. 3 of 4.
All right, I have a whole lot more questions, but this has been so fascinating, exactly what I was hoping for. I kind of didn't think we'd get to all the questions. We'll probably schedule something to reconnect and dive into those, but I do have my standard wrap-up questions. And so, Dr. Murray, do you have a target age that you want to live to?
I look at it and I go, of course, I want a health span. I want to, like my mom used to say, I don't want to blink out, So I am fascinated by the world, and, the longest I could live, the better, so I'd love to live to 100, but I think we have the capacity, especially people being born today, that we could see 100, 120, even more so if you look at like CRISPR technology and other things, we might be able to just edit aging out of our experience. I think I'm probably past that due date, unfortunately, maybe not, we never know. But I wanted to, I was like, I have done a lot of things to sort of, stave off using current technology. But to me, I don't want to be here if I'm not healthy.
Yeah.
A, burden, but B, I just, I kind of look at it and I go, well, I got another trip that I can take later on, so I'll just come back next time. Yeah. So for me, I think 100 is very, very easy. 100 to 110 is very, very doable today with the technology we have.
And then how long do you think humans can live?
If we were to look at it without a lot of ingenuity and science, I think we wouldn't live nearly as long as we do today. So now we look at it and we go, gosh, we have so much healthy lifestyle that we know about, and also medical technology. I'm not, in the integrative and functional world, a lot of people are kind of anti-medicine, I'm like, those advancements like sanitation are how we got to 50, right? So I look at it and I think, we have some significant improvements that we've made that may accelerate that to, 200 years. Like if you look at David Sinclair's work and some others, like I think we're going to be shocked at the acceleration of aging science.
I agree wholeheartedly. So I jotted down 100 to 110 for your target, and then 200 for how long people could live. What 2 to 3 protocols, habits, mindsets, let's call them shortcuts because everybody likes shortcuts, for longevity and a long health span can you share?
Okay, so obviously I think everybody knows my my first opinion is going to be number one, hormone replacement. And that also includes men. They lose testosterone, guys lose testosterone, but not at the same degree, and it's more of a slow roll. Mm-hmm. But restoring hormonal balance keeps telling your body that you belong on the planet, right? It doesn't we're not restoring to full fertility, but it is an instruction set basically to the body. So I think hormone replacement is a relatively inexpensive, accessible way to help your body understand that it is available and should be on the planet. Number 2, I think, particularly in the biohacking, anti-aging, and longevity world, we get super excited about the latest technology and tool. Like we'll buy a red light therapy, and then I've got a sauna, and then I've got some sort of, and I have a lot of those, right? Yeah. But you got to do the fundamentals first. You got to get the right kind of exercise. You got to get the clean diet and, eat for longevity. You've got to get the stress under control and protect your sleep. There is not a single technology on the planet that can override those. There's nothing that can override it other than maybe CRISPR. At some point we might be able to edit your genes and things like that. But today, don't forget the fundamentals, because the tools are really cool, but they cannot make up for the fundamentals. And number 3, I think particularly for women, we have to understand that most of the biohacking and or anti-aging movement and research has been done on men, much like all the other medical research. And we are different animals, right? So our hormones are very, very important to the entire process. And that, what may work for your spouse, partner, friend, brother may not work for you from that standpoint. And to stay abreast of the research, particularly women's research, because we metabolize things different. Those hormones have differences in every single thing we do. And I think that's why I went back to get a PhD. It's not because I wanted another student loan. I wanted to.
Are you sure?
Hey, here's the thing. They gave me 30 years. I was like, cool, I'll be 85 before I pay it off. Which I thought was amusing. I'm like, obviously they didn't look at my birth date. But really, we need to contribute heavily to the research. And obviously I have a bend to use, to look at women's research so we can understand those unique things, and where it may play a role, So I think as women, being very abreast and aware of what the research says and using evidence to make those decisions, I think is really important. Because otherwise you just buy a lot of stuff and then that may not help you.
It might not even be helping. It is an interesting thought, because that was one of the topics that we might have gotten to today, which was like how the disparity in research and how it heavily favors understanding biology in men. And so, be careful about listening to what's out there and dig a little bit deeper and understand, does that actually apply to women? And then, make sure you're doing your N of 1 testing, like what actually does work for you, checking your markers, checking how you feel. What are one to two things you think people get absolutely wrong about longevity or a long health span?
I think it goes back to kind of number 2, like the fundamentals. Like I said, I think it's, particularly because early adopters to any concept, right, are your hardcore kind of, adventurous people, let's call it that. I'm a hardcore adventurous person. And that we often get fixated on what's the newest, whatever, serum technology, device, and we think that that's going to save us. Like, I think Brian Johnson is a really good example of somebody that's got an extraordinary money and facility and time and everything. But so he has every fun tool, but he's pretty hardcore on the fundamentals. Now, whether I believe all of his fundamentals or not, I don't know yet. But it's make sure that you don't forget that the basics have to be covered. Right? And I think people get that wrong. Like I've been to, biohacking conferences, and all of a sudden you're in there and you're like, oh, I want this gyroscoping, blah, 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 blah. I'm sitting there, I'm like, I have a room in my clinic, I might be able to jam that in. Like, is it really going to move the needle forward? Right? That's the question you need to ask,
Yep.
And then I would say, number 2, what people get wrong is that N of 1, right? We can always generalize data based on larger population studies, and there always is some truth to that. But, 95% of our genetics are shared, 5% are not, right? And we've got mutations in that 5% that change how we metabolize things, how our cells act, how we get rid of toxins, how we process toxins. And within that, when you get that level of precision, when you're looking at genetics and testing for epigenetic changes and all those other things, so the things that are unique to you, you can become very, very precise. And so the other thing is making sure that what you are doing has some basis of individualization that you can also, I'm a researcher. I need stuff on paper.
I need numbers.
It's like I have math. I have friends that do muscle testing and other stuff, and they're like, my muscle tester did this, and I was like, I need lab data. I was like, I want to see mathematical data and things that I can measure, because just like a business, what you measure, you can change, right? If you're not measuring it, you don't know it. So just because somebody else does it, you need to measure it.
I love that. So N of 1. Dr. Murray, how can people contact you?
So the easiest way to contact me is you can look me up at Betty Murray. So it's BettyMurray.com. There you can find me. You can go to contact us if you want to schedule an appointment. You can also, if you're interested in hormone replacement and talking with somebody that's skilled in hormone replacement and finding out how we go to that, hormoneshelp.com. You can go there. And then obviously I have my clinic Living Well Dallas in Dallas if you happen to be in Texas or in North Texas. You can always look us up there. We work in a team, so I have a team that works for me. So I have prescribers, I have nutritionists, health coaches, you name it.
It's an extensive team that you've put together an amazing brick and mortar practice, and now you're expanding kind of around at least the United States, if not the globe. And that's I'm pretty excited for you. That's pretty.
I'd
awesome.
love to do global. That's a little bit of a challenge regulatory wise, but
yeah.
I have grand hope.
That. What in the near future are you excited about?
Wow, so with my telemedicine company Minerva, we are working on a women's digital health platform, because what's missing is the few people. So 1.83% of women get treatment for perimenopause and menopause. So there's a huge gap, and all the companies that are out there today basically say, hey, start hormone replacement. And if your symptoms of hot flashes and night sweats, which are easy to sort of understand, are better, then you're fine. Well, I'm going to give a really good example. We had a woman come in who was 63, had been on hormones for 8 years. She had a DEXA about 7 years ago, had another DEXA, and then we ran lab work to see what her hormones levels were. Well, her DEXA, which is a scan to look at bone mineral density, got significantly worse over that time period. So estrogen is the primary driver of bone building, and that's why women lose bone when they go through menopause. So this woman had been on hormone replacement. When we looked at her lab work, her hormone level for estrogen was 35. So that was what estradiol was, which is not physiological to protect the brain, the heart, the bones. So the reality is she was on hormones. She wasn't having hot flashes. She thought she was doing something good for her body, but she wasn't protecting anything. So, what we want to do is be able to provide that level of data to women, whether they're doing hormones or not. You need to know your own data. So the platform will have the ability to track symptoms, wearable data, your laboratory data. And then on the prescribing side, our telemedicine experts know what they're looking at and know how to replace appropriately. Then we can also get prescription data, because that's a little bit of a black box. It's a guessing game, and anybody that tells you otherwise is lying. That basically people that are treating, they apply it and they're like, okay, if your symptoms are better, thumbs up, right? But we want symptoms better and laboratory data showing improvement, and also showing that you can package it and get rid of it when you're done with it. And so we want to bring that precision. And so that's where I'm bringing my old tech in, Chris. So I still have tech. I'm bringing that in along with the treatment. And so I'm very excited about that. We're raising capital to build that platform, because we're going to have it direct to consumer and also direct to clinicians so they can use it too with their patients.
Okay, so that's awesome. So if somebody's in the Dallas area, they can find you, and all of the links they can find at bettymurray.com, right? Like, so all of them there. But you also have hormoneshelp.com. Is that?
That's the telemedicine side.
That's the telemedicine side. And then also, does that tie into Minerva, or Minerva's?
Yes, that is Minerva. So
Okay.
Minerva is the overarching brand for the national brand.
Okay.
And just so everybody knows, Minerva is the goddess of medicine, science, and war.
And it's spelled MENRVA.com. So I've visited that website and doing all this research. You're doing so many exciting things. People can reach out to you, connect with you, follow you. You probably have a newsletter that delivers great value. Go connect with Dr. Murray. And Dr. Murray, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. I so enjoyed it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. Make sure to subscribe and follow. Also, make sure not to be that guy, the guy sharing this podcast with people who are not interested in living beyond the norms. If you would like to learn more about the ESS60 molecule, the molecule responsible for the single longest longevity experimental result on mammals in history, a full 90% extension of life, visit myvitalc.com. That's myvitalc as in carbon.com.